Welcome to Secure Software Development. As usual, we will begin the class the same way we always do, by talking about atomic physics. Now, all computation is physical, right? Data occupies physical space. Flipping bits consumes power and it takes time. So computations always exist somewhere in the physical world. Even virtual worlds have to exist in the physical world. But what does that mean? Well, as an interesting aside, and I do find this topic interesting, there's something called Landauer's limit. This is the minimum amount of free usable energy necessary to erase a bit. That is, if a bit is stored somewhere and we want to return that to a pure entropic state, basically turn it into something that we don't know what's there, we couldn't predict what's there, we need a small amount of energy to do that, and that energy is given by a formula proposed by Rolf Landauer, and that is the Boltzmann constant, which is joules per Kelvin, times the temperature in Kelvin, times the natural log of 2. Now, this was controversial for a long time. It's still kind of controversial, but it's survived a lot of experimental validation. It's been shown to apply to quantum computing also. And since Ralph proposed this in 1961, it's been shown to be potentially derivable from the second law of thermodynamics. Now, if this topic interests you, this notion of limits on computation imposed by physics, go look at Moore's law. More significantly, go look at Brimmermann's limit. That's a really big one that you should look into, especially if you're interested in the limits of cryptography. Kumi's law, Denard's scaling is the same kind of thing. It reached its end. Denard's scaling sort of came to a close around 2009. And then look at reversible computing also. Reversible computing has a lot of connections to quantum computing. So if that's a topic that interests you, by all means go and look at reversible computing. But none of those are directly relevant to us here. Let's also think a little bit about side channels. So side channels came up previously when we talked a little bit about systems theory. We said, hey, a channel is something over which communication takes place. And a side channel is something over which unintentional communication can take place. And in this case, in these graphs, we're looking at the power side channels. We're very precisely watching power being used by a computer as it does some work. And that work in this case is the Advanced Encryption Standard, AES. It turns out that if you very closely watch the power side channel while some AES operations are going on, you can reverse engineer the AES key and break the cryptography. Interesting stuff. Again, not something we have to dig into too deeply here. Let's stop and step back for a moment and think about the storage in your computer. Again, computers are ridiculously complicated beasts, and why should storage be any different? So let's say you have 4 cores in your machine. They're each going to have an L1 and an L2 cache. They're going to share an L3 cache, and that's going to be ultimately communicating with the DRAM system. And DRAM is going to communicate with your SSD, etc. So there's a whole hierarchy of memory. Even within the little CPUs, I don't show this, but even within the little CPUs themselves, there are write-back caches. There are little local caches that hold intermediate results of operations. And sometimes they get written back and sometimes they don't. Takes up a lot of space on the die. There's a lot going on here. Again, computers are ridiculously complex beasts. So let's think for a minute about DRAM. IBM patented DRAM in 1968, so DRAM and I are the same age. It's dynamically refreshed random access memory. And over on the right, you see a picture of the Intel 1103, the first commercially produced DRAM memory chip. Denard is often given credit for a lot of these advances, but Toshiba and others should probably get some credit as well. So that chip over on the right stored about 1 kilobit, that is 1024 bits, or about 128 bytes. Well, exactly 128 bytes, sorry. This worked well, except that occasionally it suffered something we'll call bit line to cell coupling. Okay? On the silicon itself, as you know, when there's conductor and when charge is moving through a conductor, you get a field around that conductor. So if charge is moving down a conductor, you can take your right hand and you can point your thumb in the direction charge is moving and curl your fingers, and you get an electric field that curls in that direction according to the right hand rule. So that field then reaches out and it can influence other conductors. Right? If that field wraps itself around another conductor, you get charge flow in the direction of your thumb in that conductor. Maybe that's what you want, and maybe that's not what you want. Okay? So, but that kind of coupling can occur, especially when there are conductors that are very close together. And this causes a disturbance error in that other conductor, and in fact causes a disturbance error in this memory. So let's stop and let's think a little bit about how DRAM cells work. The most common type is the single transistor, single capacitor memory cell because it's the simplest. The 1968 patent uses a P substrate and then some N-type etching on there. What is P and N? So we're not in an electrical engineering class, but basically silicon is a semiconductor, and its little outer shells are full of electrons, and it's pretty happy, or they're mostly full of electrons. It's pretty happy. And what we can do is we can dope it, and by doping I mean we can insert other elements into the matrix. And I think they tend to be, let's see, I think boron is one. I can't remember what we use that has extra electrons. But if we put something in there that has fewer electrons in its valence shell, then we can think of holes as moving through it and it ending up with a basic positive charge, and that's a p-type. If we put something with some extra electrons in its valence shell, those electrons will tend to migrate around the structure and it'll give the whole thing a negative charge, and that's an N. And we can put them together just like it says, NPN or PNP, and then we can do stuff to that middle layer which impedes or facilitates the flow of electrons across it, and that results in a transistor. That's what a transistor does. If you look over on the left-hand side, that thing inside the circle is a schematic representation of a transistor. And you can see there's a channel that connects the collector over to the emitter. And then there's a little thing that comes down, which is labeled base. And you can think of the base as a gate. It opens to allow charge to flow between the collector and emitter, or it can be closed to impede the flow of charge between those two. All right, now enough of that. The address line up at the very top there, commonly called the word line for the purposes of DRAM, is connected to the transistor base, or the gate, that allows or impedes the flow. So when I put some voltage on the address line, it's going to open that gate up and allow charge to flow. The bit line over there is connected to one side of the transistor's channel, and I put a storage capacitor over on the other end of the channel. And there you go. Now, how would this work? Well, to set a bit, I'll put some voltage, I'll drive the bit line high. So you can see over here the bit line has been enabled. There's some charge available on that line, or at least some voltage on that line, some potential that could drive charge across the transistor and charge the capacitor. But right now the gate's closed. So then what I would do is I would drive the address line high, apply some voltage to that. That opens up the gate and allows the charge to then flow over and collect on the capacitor. And then as the charge builds up there, it gets stored, right? A capacitor you can think of as two plates. separated by a dielectric or an insulator, and the charge builds up on one of the plates and is held there by capacitance. All right, and this shows it connected to ground. In reality, it's seldom connected to ground. It's usually connected to a low voltage source. How do I erase a bit? So now you can see I have some charge stored over in my capacitor. It's reaching up, but it's blocked by the gate at the transistor, so the charge can't drain out that way. So what I do to read it is, once again, I apply some voltage to the address line to open the gate. Charge is now able to flow over to the bit line, and then I use some sense measurement to measure the voltage available to me on the bit line. Now, what happens to this charge on the capacitor? Well, it flows out through the transistor, which means that reading is destructive. It's going to drain the charge on the capacitor through the bit line. So before the charge gets placed in a sense amplifier, which I'm not going to talk about, it gets copied to an output buffer, which I'm not going to talk about, but then it also needs to be written back to memory. Now, you can think of these as discrete operations. In reality, what happens is a little more elegant, I'll say. The bit line is charged up to, let's say, about 0.5 volt. And if the capacitor is empty, that's going to pull that voltage down. If the capacitor is fully charged, it's going to push that voltage up. That's going to be sensed, and the result of that is, if it rises, then it's going to be driven all the way up to about 1.4 volts. If it drops, it's going to be driven down to 0 volts. And that will have the effect of charging or discharging the capacitor based on what was there previously. It fixes the charge of the capacitor either back to full or back to empty. And so it basically refreshes that byte. But you can think of this as, it's read and then it's written back to the capacitor. That's a fine way to think about it. Now, over time, the storage capacitor is going to lose charge, and that happens for two reasons. The capacitor's dielectric is not perfect, so that insulator between the plates, that's not perfect. Charge is going to leak across the capacitor. When you model a capacitor, sometimes you'll show a little resistor between the two plates in the sort of the full model of a capacitor. And that little parallel resistance means it is a way to account for the bleed across the capacitor's dielectric. But it's also the case that transistors in these circuits are tiny, right? They're down on the level of nanometers. And what that means is electrons accumulating at one side, or charge accumulating at one side, can tunnel across that and leak out. So there you go. That can leak out, and over time, you lose the charge on the capacitor. So what you need to do is figure out how fast a charge leaks out. And then often enough, you need to go ahead and read all of memory. So you read a row, read a row, read a row, and you work through all of them periodically. And remember, reading basically refreshes what's there. And so you refresh each row in memory, and you do that several times a second. As a result, it's dynamically refreshed, and the memory stays persistent as long as you're applying power. When power is lost, then all of these effects happen, and you basically lose the contents of memory. You can slow it down by cooling it. That's why sometimes people will turn the machine off, spray the stuff with Freon, and yank them out to try to get forensic information. It kind of works, but not great. But there you go. If you want to know more than you ever wanted to know about how DRAM works, go ahead and watch this video. This is a wonderful video. It's a long video, but it's wonderful. It goes into a lot of details. It tells you a lot about the computer itself, a lot about how other parts of it work together with RAM to make that work, and it's pretty neat. Even their ad pivot in this is interesting. This video was sponsored by, I think, Crucial. And so even the ad pivot in this is pretty neat stuff. So let's talk about parasitic capacitance. When components in a circuit are really close together, I say it's components here, but really when conductors are close together, they act like a capacitor. And that's always true. So if I have a conductor on one side of my desk and I have another conductor on the other side of my desk, there's some capacitance that I could specify between those two. There's always capacitance between conductors. And normally it can be ignored. Normally it's not a problem. Just like, right, all capacitors have some inherent resistance, the series resistance from the wire. They have some series inductance because wire has inductance, and normally you can ignore those effects. But it becomes difficult to ignore this capacitance when things get really, really, really small and close together, or frequencies get really high frequencies. And you can think of it almost like one of the conductor on one side of my desk, driven at a high frequency, is acting as an antenna that's broadcasting out a signal that's received in the sympathetic vibrations by the conductor on the other side of my desk. Bad things can happen. Lots of coupling and that kind of stuff can happen. Parasitic capacitance is capacitance that forms between these two conductors. Capacitance, as you remember, is a way of storing charge. So basically, this causes charge to get stored in a conductor, and we don't want that. We want charge flowing beautifully like water through these conductors, and now it's being stuck in these eddies, and it's not going where we want it to go. So parasitic capacitance can be a problem. Computer memory, stuff's really close together, and it can operate at very high frequencies, right? That's a place where parasitic capacitance is going to show up. And in 1990, there was a really good paper on this, parasitic capacitance effect of the multi-level interconnects in DRAM circuits. In fact, this was a problem that was known before then. It was known way back when DRAM was basically first created. But it's really well explained in this paper, and the source of it is linked in the references at the end. And it says, as circuit speeds and layout densities increase, more attention must be paid to the interconnects. Improperly designed interconnects can result in an increase of signal delay because of losses and noise as a result of crosstalk. The parasitic capacitance effect in VLSI circuits have been studied by numerous authors. And that's true. Like I said, this is a known thing. In the megabit DRAMs, the bit line mutual capacitance, bit line to word line coupling capacitance, bit line depletion capacitance, and bit line to metal 1 and metal 2 parasitic capacitance. And I've got a figure for this that I didn't reproduce here. All of these capacitances can cause memory errors. All right. So what if I wanted to cause a memory error? Well, repeatedly writing to a row can, again, using that parasitic capacitance causing charge to build up on the adjacent rows, can eventually result in a memory error. So I would repeatedly hammer or write to a row, and that can cause the rows around that row in the memory to have memory errors. That works, but it's kind of hit or miss. It's slow. It's not sort of ideal, but I can make it better if I do it with two rows. So if I can get the two rows around the row I want to cause an error in, then I can hammer on them intermittently, and I can cause more likely an error in that intermediate middle row. And in fact, that can be done. How would you do that? Well, it turns out that cache line flush is an unprivileged instruction. You can do it from user level code, and it would look like the assembly you see over there. So I would take the contents of a register, write it into memory location X, take the contents of a register, write it into memory location Y, or X and Y, or somewhere on those different rows, and then I would flush the cache for those addresses, causing those rows to be written out, and I would just repeatedly do that as fast as I can, hammering on those two rows until I get an error. Can it be exploited? Yeah, it can be exploited. Seaborn 2015 is a paper that introduces us to some really interesting attacks. They used a couple different methods for doing it. I'll give you a very coarse way of applying this. Suppose I make a bunch of copies of something that I would like to manipulate, like the page table, right? If I start lots and lots of processes, I create copies of the page table. Pretty soon memory is full of copies of the page table. So if I get a memory error, it's probably going to occur in a page table. And if I'm fortunate, that will cause one of the page tables that I have access to point to another, or part of a page table that I have access to point to one of the other page tables, allowing me to go modify that page table and take over the machine. Well, this all requires that I run code natively on a computer in a compiled language. Or maybe I can find a platform that provides features that can be exploited to do the same thing, like a language runtime. If so, maybe I can use it. Is it hard? Of course it's hard, right? I mean, it's hard. Memory controllers tend to randomize state for a lot of reasons, and the top bits of a memory address are basically, you can think of them as being hashed or random. But that problem has been solved. Some smart folks have gone out there and figured out how that works, and you're now able to predict where that should be. And as time goes on, like I've mentioned how security degrades, these kinds of attacks seem to be getting easier. Now you need timing, you need physical access, you need ordering of events to make this work, but all of that is getting easier and easier and easier until finally, using this technique, which is called Rowhammer, to cause bit flips and ultimately give yourself root permissions can be done. In this case, it's being done on Android phones. Permissionless apps take only a second to root phones from LG, Samsung, and Motorola. You can go read about that on Ars Technica. And this is from a few years ago, 2016. What's happened since then? Well, in 2020, RAM bleed. This allowed us to read bits in memory without accessing them. Okay? I don't want to get into the details of that. It's a good paper. Feel free to read it. The basic idea is you can exploit the same technique to read the contents of memory. Read the contents of memory you shouldn't have access to. You shouldn't be able to access this memory. It's protected memory. It's kernel memory. But you can get access to it and read it, and that's bad. You can even do it remotely. Something called NetHammer induces Rowhammer faults through network requests. What? What? Well, here's the interesting part of that. I reproduced part of their abstract because it contains this great sentence. We present NetHammer, a remote Rowhammer attack without a single attacker-controlled line of code on the targeted system. Not even JavaScript, right? So there's no attacker-controlled code running on your computer, and they still can launch this attack. NetHammer works on commodity, consumer-grade systems that are protected with quality of service techniques that use uncached memory, flush instructions, non-temporal instructions, while handling network requests, right? So you basically hammer the network card, and it communicates with the processor to allow you to hammer memory. I just find that to be pretty neat. So what's the point of all this? So critical code tends to employ randomization, and that's to prevent side channel attacks and to make attacks that exploit regular timing more difficult. Also, don't leave secrets lying around in memory. Get them out of memory quickly if you don't need them to be present in memory for a long time. Physical attacks can happen remotely. They can undercut your software security. They can be enabled by software, right? So if you've got a virtual machine that does these various things, you can potentially exploit that to launch a Rowhammer attack, even without the ability to run native code, because the native code you need to run is executed by the virtual machine. What are the implications for development? Again, one of the lessons I want you to take away is that all systems are vulnerable. Maybe your code was invulnerable yesterday, but today people have uncovered this clever attack on the physical hardware to subvert the system, and now it's vulnerable. All systems are vulnerable. If your code can't be exploited, perhaps the hardware can. If the hardware can't be, exploit the user. If the user can't be exploited, then maybe there are policies and procedures and infrastructure around the user and the system that you can exploit. Maybe there's a way for me to exploit parts of the system to get information that allows me to then exploit the system. Good example of this is looking at any social engineering type attacks. Be sure memory randomization is enabled. Most modern operating systems support address space layout randomization, or ASLR. Lots of good reasons to do that, from preventing ROP gadgets to protecting against this kind of attack, etc. And remove secrets from memory at the earliest opportunity. Always do that. If a secret gets loaded into memory, like a password or key or some other structure, even just a cryptographic structure that you've used to compute a hash, get rid of that. Don't just deallocate it, but override it, because partial information present in that structure could be used to reduce the search space for the password or the key or the hash. All right? Watch out when you do this. As we've already seen, optimization can remove code that it thinks has no effect, right? Security code, that's not written for effect, that's written for security, and compilers can sniff that out and say, oh, that should be deleted. If I get rid of the security code, system's faster. So watch out for that. All right, we talked about physical protection last time. Let's talk about cyber protection this time, and we're going to talk about it through the lens of the NIST 5 functions, because it's kind of parallel to what we saw in the physical space earlier. The NIST 5 functions is this document produced by the U.S. National Institute of Standards and Technology, and it's part of their cybersecurity framework. And just like it says, there are 5 of them: identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. So what are these? Well, the identify function assists in developing an organizational understanding. The identify function is, what are you protecting? Figure out what you're protecting, right? What things do you really want to protect? Information is all interrelated. So when you figure out that you want to protect some piece of information, identify the other information that could be used to potentially compromise that, or again, reduce the search space for it, and be sure to protect that too. Identify policies and procedures that are relevant to what you need to protect, right? Do you have information about children? There are laws about that. Do you have information about people's protected health information? Laws about that, right? So be aware of what you're protecting and how you need to protect it. The protect function supports the ability to limit. Okay, fine. It's how will you protect these things, right? What systems am I going to put in place in order to protect the stuff that I identified earlier that I need to protect? In some cases, you'll be told how to protect it. You will have to use FIPS 140 certified encryption, etc. In other cases, it's up to you to figure out how best to protect those things. The detect function defines the appropriate activities to identify the occurrence of a cybersecurity event. Detecting stuff, right? I mean, what do you do to detect intrusions or tampering? But I'm developing software. I'm not detecting intrusions unless I'm developing intrusion detection software. Your software can use information. You can distribute information in such a way that you can compare, let's say, the contents of a database against a prior hash of that database to discover the database has been tampered with. Tamper detection is part of some commercial software. It's part of some video game software. If you want your systems to be highly secure, consider implementing some tamper detection in the data itself. This at least, maybe the adversary comes in, they know about this, and they do the work to recompute the hash. That still requires that they do more work. It delays what they're trying to do. And if your system is running and constantly changing all this stuff, it may cause them to be caught while they're trying to do that. The respond function. Take appropriate activities regarding detected. Basically, what are you going to do when you detect something? So let's say you do implement a detection system, tamper detection, and you detect tampering. Okay, now what? What is your response to having detected tampering? Okay, So you're going to have to issue something, an alarm, an alert. You're going to have to potentially delete some data. But you need to take the appropriate action to protect whatever it is you're trying to protect. And then finally, the recover function. Take appropriate activities to maintain plans for resilience and restore services, right? This is how will you recover from a breach? You detected something. You took the appropriate actions based on that. What do you do next? Should you be able to get your data back? Is that something that you need to do? Or is the data stored offline somewhere else and there's a process for restoring from backups, right? Ransomware. Ransomware is a really good place where one of the things that you need to do is figure out how to recover. And in that case, the best is to have backups that can't be corrupted by the ransomware attacker. All right, let's go ahead and, now that we've covered both physical and we've run pretty quickly through the NIST 5 functions, let's compare the two and see where they relate. So over on the left-hand side, the physical protections, the 5 there: deter, detect, delay, respond, and neutralize. Over on the right, the cyber protections from the NIST framework: identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. Over on the left, protection is built from the inside out, right? You build layers around the thing you want to protect, and the layers are designed to slow the advance of the adversary so they can be detected, they can be neutralized. Over on the right, protection is often built outside in. Really? Yeah, your first layer of protection is usually establish a perimeter. Defend the perimeter with firewalls and intrusion detection. And as you move in, you may still have some other detection, but you'll probably have different kinds of protection, and you'll build that from the outside in. Why? Over on the left, we want to slow things down, but over on the right, we still want fast movement for authenticated users. You want to print something, you don't have to go through a bunch of hoops to print it. You want to send it to the printer and have it print. Well, those are conflicting goals, and so things are handled a little bit differently. Still, we can try to map some of these. Detect is present in both, right? So we have a detect function on both sides. We have a respond function on both sides, right? When you need a detection, what are you going to do? On the left, we have neutralize, right? We're going to do something to prevent the advance of the adversary. On the right, we have recover. Those aren't really the same thing, but neutralize is sort of the penultimate action for a threat or an attack on the left. Recover is the penultimate, I keep saying penultimate, is the final, I shouldn't say penultimate, I should say final action or function for an attack over on the right. Okay? Deter and delay are unique to the physical protection framework. Now, that doesn't mean they have to be, right? They just only show up in the physical protection framework we looked at. They don't show up over in the NIST 5 functions. Over in the NIST 5 functions, we have identify and protect, and those are unique to the cyber protection framework. All right? And we note that identify is figure out what you're protecting. That doesn't really occur over on the left-hand side, right? We presume you know what you're protecting over in the physical side of things. So, that's how they map to each other. There are some unique aspects of each one, and there are some common aspects of each one, some commonalities we can pull out. And I think comparing and contrasting the two reveals some stuff. Delay and deter, those are certainly relevant to cyber protection. If I can slow down a cyber attacker, if I can deter them, great, right? Over on the cyber side, identify and protect. Well, I need to do that for physical stuff too. I got to figure out what I want to identify and how I'm going to protect it. Those just aren't necessarily called out. And so these show a difference in the way the protection culture has evolved in these two areas. All right, can we use any of this in software design? Absolutely. Divide a complex system into layers, and the layers can have different access restrictions. In fact, we'll talk more about that a little later on. We can delay some actions, right? Your phone, for example, does this. You enter a bad PIN. You enter a bad PIN again. You fat finger of the pen the third time, and it might delay you. It might say, hey, you got to wait a minute before you can enter the pen again. We're slowing you down to make brute force attacks impractical. There are ways around that. We'll talk about that later in the class. We can try to neutralize a threat by locking the software if security properties are violated, or even by destroying the data. That's maybe an extreme case. When we get to the case study, we'll see how that can be used to make a system very secure. Directly neutralizes the attacker. We detect the threat, we throw away all the data, which is what the attacker is there to get. Then they can't get the data and they can't accomplish their mission. The minimum set of questions that you need to answer: what are you trying to protect? Who are you trying to protect it from? Are you trying to protect it from casual hackers, script kiddies, quote unquote? Or are you trying to protect it from a nation state actor? Those are very different levels of adversary that require very different kinds of protection. And for how long are you trying to protect it? Right? Cryptography systems are often rated on how long they expect that standard to be resilient against attacks. Right? So if you're trying to protect something if the data you're trying to protect is really only going to be relevant for the time it's passing through your system, maybe you just need to slow an attacker down, and that does what you need to do. If it's going to be relevant for a long time, for years, then you've got to take other measures to protect it so that an adversary doesn't get it, because that data is really relevant. Asking these questions and coming up with answers to them will hopefully answer the question of how you need to go about protecting your system, or at least drive you toward a set of solutions. And then finally, you have to ask yourself, what's your plan for when protective measures fail, right? Something fails, what's going to be my response to that? And so you've got to come up with, okay, when this stuff breaks, what do I do next? And that's critical. What are you trying to protect? That's the identify function from the NIST framework. And maybe you don't protect everything. Right? If you've been through training about personally identifiable information, you've probably learned that not all information is personally identifiable information. Some stuff requires different levels of security than other stuff, and you should be conscious about that. You should also be conscious that giving any information to an adversary is bad. So you have to think about how information relates to other information. We'll talk about that in some more detail when we get to the section on privacy. But it can be impractical to protect everything, so you know what? Figure out where you're going to spend your security budget. If you can discover that a particular email has an account on the site, then you can do a search of databases and then try all passwords associated with that email. This is a case where giving an adversary a little information, like letting them know that someone has an account on that site, can help them zero in and target their attacks just against that. That's bad, right? There are breach databases out there. And so that information, in this case an email address, can be leveraged by an attacker to try to get access to someone's account. So the best policy, when possible, is to always minimize the amount of information given out. Okay? And I like to use this example of messages that come back when you try to log in. So if I try to log in and it tells me that username was not found in the system, oh boy, right? I mean, that's great. That means I can try until I get a username that is found on the system. And now I just attack that username. And if the username is an email address, that's even better. It might tell me incorrect password. Well, that has the same effect, right? Oh, the username was right, so the password's wrong. I'll just keep trying until I get something that doesn't hit. Incorrect username or password is better. That's better, right? That tells me that something was wrong. I'm not going to tell you what. Good luck logging in. My favorite is still unable to log in. I don't even know. Does that mean that they have an account? They don't have an account? The system is down? What does that even mean? I don't know what that means. It tells me nothing about what just happened, except that it didn't log me in. So, again, think about minimizing the information that you give back to an adversary. Not everything has to have the same level of protection, right? Maybe you don't super high encrypt everything, but you still need to be doing at least the minimum, which is not giving information to attackers. Who are you trying to protect it from, right? Different adversaries have different tactics, techniques, and procedures, TTP. Some adversaries might rely on technical measures of attack. They might crack passwords, crack hashes. They might create a man in the middle because they have access and the technical ability to go and intercept your packets before they get to you, right? They can go and literally access machines that are on a path between different endpoints. Other adversaries may be able to establish an insider, right? Maybe my superpower, as Bruce Wayne famously says in one of the movies, is that he's rich. So I'll just pay one of your people to give me your information. Problem solved, okay? Maybe you're dealing with a nation state, and they can use the police. They use police to imprison, subpoena, maybe even do things a little extrajudicially, right? Like the cartoon there, hit you with the $5 wrench. There are a number of ways that different organizations, different people, different adversaries can attack you, and it depends upon who is doing the attacking. For how long you're trying to protect it, right? The first lesson here, which is important, right? The first lesson of security is that everything is vulnerable. But a lesson that should be up there with the rest of this, in terms of like cryptography, is that nothing stays hidden forever. So there's an excellent article, The Physics of Brute Force, which is interesting to read. And there's a tool, the key length tool, which is fun to play around with, which helps you determine how long a key should be. Now, this all assumes you're dealing with purely technical methods, right? If you've got insiders and spies and someone's hitting you with a wrench, all this goes out the window. But if this kind of thing is interesting to you, like the physics of brute force especially, if that's interesting to you, we mentioned Brammerman's limit earlier on. I'm going to plug it again. I think it's a fascinating result, and you should go have a look at it. All right. Now I mentioned layers, and that gets to thinking about defense in depth. Now, defense in depth is not what everybody thinks that it is. The principle of defense in depth is that we layer security mechanisms to increase the security of a system. An attacker who penetrates a layer still encounters resistance. And maybe it's easier for the attacker to move further in, but that just results in them being surrounded and caught and defeated. In a military sense, what you would do, you can think of different tactics militarily. I put all my attackers on the front line. All my defenders on the front line. So if an adversary breaks through my line, I'm in trouble. They're through the line. I don't have anything in reserve behind that. So maybe what I do is I spread my defenders out. I have fewer defenders on the front line. That maybe makes it easier for an attacker to breach the line, but when they do, they encounter the other defenders at subsequent lines behind that, and maybe I'm actually able to then let them break through, encircle them, and defeat them. Okay, so don't put everything on one layer, because when they break through that layer, then you've got nothing in reserve. So, defense in depth occurs throughout systems. Over on the right-hand side, I have an example of defense in depth that comes up in nuclear reactor safety, one of the places where you'll first find the term being used. And so you see right in the center, we have controls that are there to prevent deviations, right? Prevent the problem from ever starting, right? Prevent a runaway nuclear reaction that could result in a meltdown. We don't want that, so we have controls that are right there in the center. Once we get outside that and something bad has happened, a deviation has gotten out, we want to prevent escalation. We want to prevent this from becoming a really bad day for everybody. And so we have things like scram or shutdown, which can then react and shut the reactor down and hopefully control for those problems. That may also, sometimes you can escape that. If you want to see an example of escaping a reactor shutdown that's triggered, go and look at the movie Chernobyl, and you'll see, there's a really good discussion in there of how this problem occurred. Well, okay, so something bad has happened, and now we need to control the consequences of this. So we have shielded facilities, we have lots of stuff around it to protect against that. We want to confine radioactivity, so we have moderators, we have thick concrete cladding, we have other stuff to control that. And finally, at the very end, we mitigate the release. We have monitoring technologies that can set off alarms, that can do other things if there is an unintended release of radioactivity. All right, different layers. The different layers operate independently of each other, which is important. If you have 10 layers and each layer uses the same firewall software, once they've defeated it at one layer, they pretty much defeated it at every layer, and there's no defense in depth. Okay, so the layers need to be independent so that they fail independently or have to be exploited independently. And they also need to be at different layers. If you have 20 defenses at the perimeter, you don't have defense in depth. You just have a lot of defenses at that one layer. And when they get through that layer, too late. So you have to distribute these at different layers. And we'll see a possibly more extreme example of this when we look at some of the more advanced models of security. This is sometimes called the security onion model because it's like an onion, right? Like ogres have layers, security can have layers. So, 2 things for defense in depth that you should keep in mind. Security measures used for defense in depth require different methods, knowledge, or capabilities to subvert. And defenses are applied at multiple levels of the system. So bypassing or subverting one level does not completely compromise security of the entire system. Right? It maybe lets you advance a little bit, but then you're going to encounter new resistance from new types of defenses. All right. Homework due 10th September. The homework is to apply that physical security stuff we talked about in the previous class. Pick a physical system and then apply the 5 functions: detect, deter, delay, respond, and neutralize, and see for the system you picked which ones are addressed, which ones are not addressed, and when they're not addressed, how could they be addressed, or could they be addressed? Maybe that's really hard. Give some thought to each of these and give some thought to whether or not each is really implemented. And that's it.